Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast for the foreign policy and global development communities and anyone who wants a deeper understanding of what is driving events in the world today. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg, editor of UN Dispatch. Enjoy the show. At the United Nations, debates over gender equality, reproductive health, and women's rights were not always as polarized as they are today. When I started covering the UN as a journalist in the early 2000s, the feminist movement, broadly speaking, was in ascendance and very much driving discussions around gender issues at the UN. To be sure, when certain debates arose, more traditionally conservative or religiously oriented members of the UN would insert themselves, but the momentum, back then at least, was not in their favor. This is not as much the case today. And according to my guest, Jelena Cupac, that is because of the ascendance of a transnational network of conservative anti-feminist NGOs operating at the United Nations. Jelena Cupac is a PhD with the Berlin Social Science Center. She is the co-author with Irem Ebeturk of an article in the academic journal International Affairs, which examines how this network of conservative NGOs has been able to influence debates over women's rights at the United Nations. The article is titled Backlash, Advocacy, and NGO Polarization Over Women's Rights in the United Nations, and it really does helpfully identify and define a trend that I've noticed as a journalist covering the United Nations, which is the growing influence and impact of anti-feminist NGOs. I'll post a link to the journal International Affairs where the article can be read. It really is a fascinating article, and I'm glad to shine a spotlight on it. All right, now here is my conversation with Jelena Cupac, PhD. When I started covering the UN, you didn't really have too many anti-feminist NGOs roaming the halls. I mean, they were there, but they didn't have much power. To the extent that there were anti-feminist movements or movements to block progress on women's rights and LGBT rights early on when I started covering these issues in the year 2005 or so, it was really led by the Vatican. Over years, I've seen this increasing prominence of this network of anti-feminist conservative NGOs seeking to block progress on women's rights at the UN. And your article very helpfully puts this in perspective, I think. So I wanted to kick off by asking you, how was it that these groups began to emerge, and when did these groups begin to emerge and start to become a force at the United Nations?
Yes, in our research and in the research of some of the feminist NGOs, we trace their emergence or their kind of increased activity somewhere in the 2004. In 2004, the UN was marking the International Year of the Family, but there was very little interest among civil society to actually organize this event. And then some of the Mormon NGOs and Qatar, the state Qatar, decided that this was a very good opportunity to actually jump in, to use this opening, to use this opportunity and do something with it. So they organized Doha International Conference for Family in 2004. And this was an opportunity where they actually gathered a lot of conservative NGOs, anti-feminist NGOs, mostly with religious inclinations, but also some of the states that espouse a more conservative and religious views. And that was actually the event where they kind of coalesced around this idea of the natural and traditional family. So all the way back to the 2004, and I don't think in 2004 we were aware that something big was actually coming. But the increased activity of these organizations, we can see it in the last 10 years. So in these last 10 years, we can really see that more and more of the conservative organizations are seeking a consultative status within the ECOSOC, which would allow them to actually do things within the UN.
Let me just stop you there and explain to listeners who are not familiar with the kind of bureaucratic processes of getting credentialed at the United Nations. But basically, if you are to enter the UN grounds, you need a pass. As a journalist, I go through the media office to get a pass. If you're you work at like the US mission, you can, go to some office at the UN to get your delegate's pass. But then, the UN also wants to be accessible to NGOs and civil society. And the process of getting a credential is a bit more onerous. You have to go through this whole like application process and eventually be voted on in like a panel at the Economic and Social Council, ECOSOC. So you have a group of countries that vote on who gets to get a credential at the United Nations. And interestingly, you're talking earlier about this alliance between conservative NGOs and more conservatively leaning countries. One of the first times I really ever understood that this kind of anti-feminist, anti-LGBT force was like a real thing at the UN was in debates and battles at ECOSOC over credentialing LGBT rights NGOs back in the Bush administration. When I first started covering this, it was this really weird thing where you would have the Bush administration ally with Iran to block LGBT rights groups from getting credentials to the UN. So that's just like an interesting kind of battle space for some of the trends that you describe in your article.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that period actually overlaps with more and more of conservative, anti-feminist, anti-LGBT NGOs coming into the UN. While the pro-LGBT NGOs were blocked, some of the conservative NGOs were actually favored, right? So I think these events very much overlap and trace back to Bush administration.
So who are some of these groups that are most active today?
So among civil sector organizations, among NGOs, we mostly have NGOs from the US Christian right. And there I would just list some of the most important names or some of the most influential organizations. So we have CFAM, that's the Center for Family and Human Rights. Then there is Family Watch International, United Families International, World Congress of Families. They're a pro-family network that spans some 80 countries and people and organizations from these countries. Heritage Foundation can also sometimes be found within this coalition that some of the commentators call the Unholy Alliance. And it is called Unholy Alliance because it includes not only Christian right, but it also includes many of the states that espouse some other religions. So we can find many of the post-Soviet states with Orthodox leanings. Of course, Russia and Belarus are very active there. Muslim states, mostly active in the Organization for Islamic Cooperation. Then there is the League of Arab States. There is also the UN Africa Group. Sometimes the G77 can also, some of the states of the G77 are also a part of this coalition. Of course, Vatican is very active. Vatican, as you said earlier, was very active in the 90s, but now they are joined with this broader coalition. Russian Orthodox Church as well. So as you can see, a very broad alliance united under the banner of the natural and traditional family.
And it's probably also worth noting, as you do in your article, that when there is a Republican administration in the United States, the U.S. is part of this alliance. You mentioned CFAM, the Center was for Family and Human Rights. This is an organization that the civil rights group, the Southern Poverty Law Center, deems a hate group. And it was a member of the Trump administration's delegation to the Commission on the Status of Women, which is an annual gathering at the UN. It's the second largest gathering at the UN outside the UN General Assembly in September. So, at times this coalition is, of course, joined by the United States.
Yeah, exactly. And that's when the United States is led by the Republicans, that's a huge opportunity structure for within the UN for many of these NGOs, and we have really seen that with Trump administration. There are some accounts that some of these organizations actually sent talking points to Nikki Haley in the UN. I cannot verify this. This is mostly what I read in the newspapers, but there are some indications that they really cooperated together a lot. But we have also seen that even in the absence of, even when the US is led by democratic governments, we also see these organizations being very active in the UN. Perhaps this opportunity structure disappears, but by now, as I said, there is this big coalition. So they're still very much influential, I would say. And it will be very interesting. We are carefully monitoring what is happening now in the UN with Biden administration. And we do see, they do recognize that there is a problem for them now, but they are still active. They are not just retreating.
And what do these groups hope to accomplish? What are some of their maybe discrete goals at the United Nations?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. And that's exactly what we were trying to tease out within our paper. So one of our questions was, why are these organizations in the UN? So if you look at the literature, at the scholarly literature, this literature, sociological and IR, international relations literature, this literature would not predict that conservative NGOs would flock towards the UN. For many reasons, one being that they see the UN as a kind of institutional enemy of theirs. So they label the UN as liberally biased. They see it as a kind of globalist and secularist force. But what we have uncovered is that they do not actually see the UN as kind of inherently evil. Right? So they more and more portray it as an institution that has been hijacked by these progressives and the liberals. And they have decided to join the UN to kind of try to regain it back, or to kind of conquer it, not regain it back. It was never actually theirs. But their hope is that by fighting women's rights norms, gender norms, LGBTQ norms, and so forth, that they can actually sway the UN in their desired normative direction. So what they do there is that they do a double thing. On the one hand, they're really engaging in this very revisionist endeavor, so trying to reverse the progress of women's rights, feminist organizations so far, but they also have a very positive agenda. So they're trying to enshrine within UN documents their pro-family and pro-life goals and norms. Yes.
And what would be like an example of a victory they have achieved in recent years, perhaps?
I think one of the most famous examples, and famous examples was the meeting of the Security Council in 2019. That is when the Security Council was supposed to adopt a ninth resolution in its women, peace, and security agenda. And this was fairly uncontroversial resolution. It was regarding, it was about violence against women and girls in conflict. But this particular document included the phrase sexual and reproductive health and rights. And the US administration, backed up largely by these NGOs, threatened to veto this resolution if the words sexual and reproductive health and rights weren't deleted from the resolution. And ultimately, these words were deleted and the resolution was adopted. Feminists were very disappointed because this was a watered down version of this resolution. Now, the important thing is that the reason why, to emphasize, the reason why conservative NGOs and states that adopt these views want to delete these phrases is because they think they're euphemisms for abortion. So there is this great fear that abortion will kind of gain status in an international document, and in this case, in an international legal document. And this was celebrated as a very, very, very big victory. But this is not happening just in the Security Council. We can see it also in the Commission on the Status of Women, this yearly happening in the UN, a yearly conference, where they also strive to delete many of the phrases that indicates progressive stances. We can see it in the Human Rights Council, also in the General Assembly.
And again, I think your example at the Security Council speaks to how significant the character of the U.S. administration is. Having a kind of a right-wing U.S. administration enables this to a great degree. I mean, again, I'm going back to years ago in my early days of covering the UN, but the switch between the Bush administration to the Obama administration saw this like sea change of LGBT rights happening at the United Nations, where suddenly you saw those LGBT rights organizations get their credentials at ECOSOC. You saw a resolution at the Human Rights Council calling gay rights are human rights are gay rights. You saw the Secretary General Ban Ki-moon appoint a special representative on gender, SOGI. I know the acronym, but I can't remember what it stands for. A special representative on sexual orientation and gender identity.
And gender identity,
yeah. So you saw like all this progress happening. And as you identify in your article, to a large degree, this anti-feminist coalition, mobilized as a backlash against that progress.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And even during the Obama administration, while we saw some of the progress on women's rights and LGBTQ rights and so forth, we still saw a lot of, we often call it a kind of spoiling behavior by these conservative groups. And we call it spoiling activity, but now more and more as they gain more power with Trump's administration, we label it as a legit backlash and call their advocacy backlash advocacy, because they are, whereas during maybe Obama's administration, they were more a kind of nuisance, a kind of menace there within the UN. With Trump administration, they have actually been able to achieve many of the gains. What we expect now to happen, it will be very interesting to observe, is whether, because they are allied with some of the other powerful states, such as Russia, that actually they will use Russia as a vehicle for their agenda as well. So that even in the absence of a Republican administration in the Security Council or a Republican representative, they will still be able to kind of damage women's rights agenda. But we're left to see this yet. Yes.
You use the framework of literature around polarization to help readers understand the implications of this dynamic that's emerging at the United Nations between, anti-feminist NGOs, conservative NGOs, and more conventional feminist NGOs. What does polarization and literature around polarization, teach us about what's happening right now?
Yeah, we have thought long and hard whether what we see right now in the UN is actually polarization around women's rights. And what we have observed is that within international relations literature, there is a kind of reluctance to use the term polarization with respect to the developments on the international level, whereas we use polarization daily to characterize what is happening within domestic societies, right? But we have decided actually to settle on this term because when we started looking closer at what both sides are doing, so both feminist and conservative NGOs are doing, we observed a lot of parallelism in their acting. And what we have observed is that in many instances, the UN is actually kind of blocked in adopting some of the documents. So we have decided to settle on this term. What this term helps us see is that the politics around women's rights within the UN has dramatically changed in the past 10 years. It has dramatically changed exactly because of conservative anti-feminist NGOs have entered the UN, because the style of their advocacy is this backlash style of advocacy, where it is equal part kind of revisionist and try to incorporate some of the new language. They're trying to co-opt human rights language. But by doing so, they have also changed the advocacy of feminist organizations. So feminist NGOs cannot continue doing what they did so far. So maybe in the 90s, feminist organizations, what they did, their advocacy wasn't smooth. They had a lot of problems, but their target was mostly states. They didn't have to fight a rival NGO group. But now with this stronger rival NGO group, which is becoming more and more skillful in what they do, more and more skillful in transnational organizing, more and more skillful in advocacy, they have to incorporate, they have to think about them when they do their advocacy. So because each side now has to pay attention to each other, we think that what we are seeing is a kind of change in how politics around women's rights is done within the UN. And we think polarization captures it nicely, because we do not see compromise. We see a lot of zero-sum behavior. We see a lot of suspicion. We see a lot of accusations. We see a lot of moral panic on both sides.
One of the implications, at least I draw from your conclusion and from using polarization as a lens to understand the fight for women's rights at the United Nations, is that unlike in times past, feminist organizations can't really push the envelope as much. Rather, they must consign themselves perhaps to defending the hard-won rights that they have already gained.
You are exactly on point. That's a fair conclusion. And they're now in this position where they have to defend what they have achieved so far, and they're actually losing a lot of ground. Within the Commission on the Status of Women, what I think is very alarming is that the Commission on the Status of Women has been instrumental in incorporating some of the feminist language into the UN and UN documents. But now we see that through this pushback, this backlash from the conservative side, there is a tendency to kind of decouple the language of human rights from the language of gender equality and women's empowerment. And this is very alarming. But maybe even more alarming for feminist organizations is that the history of their activism is also attempts are being made to delete the history of their activism. They have been instrumental in adopting the Beijing Declaration in 1995. The Beijing Declaration was then instrumental in enshrining the language of gender rights within the UN.
And I should just say the Beijing Declaration is that moment when Hillary Clinton, then as First Lady of the United States, said women's rights are human rights are women's rights. It's like it's like the foundational kind of women's rights document that informs the UN's human rights work around the world.
Yeah, exactly. And that document and the Beijing conference itself was instrumental for the establishment of the UN Women later on, and for this yearly Commission on the Status of Women. So in the kind of agreed conclusions, we see this in recent years, that in the agreed conclusions of the Commission, the work of feminist organizations is slowly being diminished or even kind of deleted. And in that sense, Mark, you are absolutely right. So feminists are now being pushed in this very defensive position. There has been a lot of reluctance to convene a fifth conference on women. The Beijing one was the fourth one. The fear is that if the fifth one was organized with the presence of so many conservative actors, not much would be gained. Actually, a lot of territory might be lost.
Wow.
Yeah.
Going forward, is there a coming debate at the UN on some issue related to reproductive health or women's rights that will suggest to you where this trend is heading? Like, is there another conference coming up or question over a resolution that you're monitoring?
So what we have been monitoring very closely recently is the initiative by UN Women called Generation Equality. It is the initiative by the UN Women, but it is hosted by the governments of Mexico and France. And partners include many feminist NGOs and many corporations. The goal is to achieve more progress towards gender equality through concrete action. A month ago, the Generation Equality had its first big meeting where many of the stakeholders pledged to commit a substantial financial funds, some $40 billion. And this caused a lot of panic among conservative actors because at the same time as they are seeing a progressive agenda being backed up by a lot of money, they're complaining that they're actually not able to collect funds for their pro-family and pro-abortion causes. So this is something that we plan to monitor, and I think media should also monitor that with this big feminist initiative, how the conservatives will react, what will be their response.
Well, thank you so much for your time. And thank you so much for that absolutely fascinating journal article.
Thank you, Mark, for having us. This was very interesting.
All right. Thank you all for listening. Thank you to Jelena Cupac. That was very interesting. And again, I encourage everyone to read her article. And I will be doing more coverage of Generation Equality, the UN initiative that she referenced at the very end of this conversation, which is just launched and which will really, I think, come into fore in the coming months. So look forward to that. All right, we'll see you soon. Bye.